Hello everyone, Pulse here to bring you yet another episode of Delving Deep ESO. Now in today's episode we're going to continue our discussion about the weapon skill lines that are going to be available in ESO, especially since we've already covered the classes that are going to be available, and that leaves us with the bow, destruction staff, and restoration staff, since we just went over the two-handed weaponry, sword and shield, and dual wielding skill lines in the previous episode. Now, before I jump right into the weapons, let me reiterate, like I've done over and over again in the previous videos when it comes to stuff pertaining to the skill lines. This is not confirmed in any way, really. It's a collective of information from beta testers and forum goers around the net, and all of the evidence combined into one sort of cohesive thing really shows that this is more than likely 100% what we're getting. Now, obviously there could be some stuff missing, but odds are this is the base idea. These are the skills we should expect to see when ESO comes out. Now, second, before I go on to the skills, I want to make sure to reiterate that the numbers, if mentioned, and I will try my best to keep them out of the equation, if they're mentioned, you have to keep in mind that in MMOs the numbers deviate and change depending on the actual game and the background algorithms and whatnot. In addition to that, though, they will change as the game progresses. So if I mention a number, just keep in mind that a number 5, for example, could be huge in Elder Scrolls Online, while it might be a weak number in another game. We just don't know at this point how the numbers will balance out, and they can change as the game progresses. Now, I'm done babbling. Let's get into what we're here for, and that is some weapon discussion. We're going to start off with which is probably the most popular weapon, at least as of now, until we get our hands on it, and that is the bow. Now, the active abilities for the bow start off with this skill, Weighted Shot, which is going to deal a little bit of damage, but most importantly provide a ranged interrupt, which we haven't seen too many skills that do so in the skills we've gone over thus far, so that's a pretty cool ability, especially from an early level. Now, the next ability is called Volley, which is going to repeatedly fire arrows at a target for about 1.5 seconds. So even though this does say instant, I do believe this is actually a channeled style ability. We see these kind of skills all the time when it comes from the archer, so I would have to imagine this is actually a channeled spell. Over the course of the channel, though, we're going to deal physical damage to the enemies in the area where you place the reticule, and it's also going to provide some immobilization on the enemy's hit. So that's pretty cool. You're going to fire up some arrows into the sky and rain down upon them. That's pretty typical MMO or fantasy archer archetype skill. Next up is Scatter Shot, if I was capable of talking correctly, which is going to deal a nice chunk of damage to a target enemy up close. This has a good bit less range than the other abilities mentioned thus far, but most importantly it's going to provide the knockback. So as, again, typical archer MMO skill line here, you're going to have an ability where if the enemy gets too close and in your comfort zone, you use the Scatter Shot to provide a knockback. This is, again, very typical. The next ability is called Arrow Spray, and much like Volley, this is labeled as an instant skill, but it seems to be more of a channeled style ability. This is going to deal physical damage to the enemy throughout the channel with each arrow that hits, and then it's going to provide a snare as well. So there's a good bit of control going on with the bow so far. That's pretty cool to see, actually. And then finally we get to Snipe, which is a substantial cast time. They label 3 seconds. This is typical MMO number. They usually do this. There's like 70% is the sprint number, 3 seconds is the this counts as a long duration spell cast. There's some very obvious copy and paste going on here, but that's not really important. What is important that this is going to give you that long range ability, which you would expect from a name like Snipe, and that's just going to do substantial damage from a long way out, but obviously that's offset by the cast time. Now, the passives start off with this skill, Hawkeye, which is going to just increase the damage of your bow attacks by about 15% or so against vulnerable targets. Now, this is a pretty cool passive. I think normally it would be pretty bland, but the idea with the bow seems to be that they've taken the typical tropes and the typical MMO ideas and added a good bit more control And then to take advantage of that, a skilled player who's making sure to take advantage of their vulnerable targets are going to do more damage. So that's a pretty nice incentive to actually play with the control and not just zerg everything. Now the next ability is called Hasty Retreat, which is going to increase move speed by about 70%, which I said earlier is kind of like the typical sprint percentage amount for about 2 seconds or so after activating a roll dodge. This is a pretty cool ability. This is a nice offset for if the enemy gets close, you can still play a little bit scrappy, you can dodge around a good bit and still have control of the situation once they get in your comfort zone. Now the next passive ability is called Accuracy, which is just going to increase critical strike damage by about 5% or so. That's easily the most bland passive we've had so far. We have Long Shots, which is going to cause about 15% bonus damage versus distant targets. Now, we don't get a concrete number or even an idea of sorts as to what a distant target label applies to. However, I would just imagine there's like this certain area at the very tail end of your left and your left mouse button attacks and your heavy attack range that at the last 5 meters of that range you get this 15% bonus damage. Obviously we don't know exactly, but that's what I would imagine here. So if you want to play the long range guy, you can do that and provide lots of damage. Now the last passive ability for the bow is called Ranger, which is going to reduce the movement speed penalty while channeling bow abilities by about 35%. Now this is one of the reasons why I'm pretty sure there's some typos going on with the actives here, because both Arrow Spray and Volley in the bow skills both read as if they were channeled abilities, but they have instant labels. So I would have to imagine that's a typo here, that these are channeled. So what this is going to allow is you'll be able to run around with a little bit more speed than normal when you're channeling the abilities. So once you get to the end game version of your bow skill line, you'll be able to actually keep that mobility up, which is kind of a theme with Rangers usually, especially with Hasty Retreat, and you have lots of control to keep enemies kind of pinned down with your skills. So I would expect this ability to come in handy for sure. Now overall, as I kind of mentioned throughout, this has got a lot of very typical Ranger archetypes or bow or archer archetypes tied to it. Pretty much all the skills have been taken directly from previous MMOs. There's nothing really interesting in these skills, honestly, but I do want to give props to Zenimax for providing a nice balance between the styles of Archer. There's a lot of control here, and there's a lot of balance between the skills, which will allow the close to mid-range play while also giving incentive to do the stay back and snipe your foes from a long way kind of play style. So you can easily play both. The easiest way to describe it is, instead of having the short bow or long bow, which is typical in other fantasy settings, maybe not MMO so much, but typical in MMO settings, or fantasy settings rather, a really good example to look at is Guild Wars 2. They have two separate weapons, and they both function very differently from one another despite both being bows. And I like this idea that instead of forcing you to use two weapons to do all of what would normally be like a Ranger archetype, instead you can just play one bow, and then you have utility with your other weapon potentially. So you can play the skirmishing bowman, or you can play the sniper from long range with just one weapon, instead of forcing people to use multiple bows just for one play style or another. Now that's very cool indeed, but that brings us onto the staves. The first one we're going to start off with is the Destruction Staff. Now, the Destruction Staff has a lot of cool things going on with it. We'll start with the active ability Destructive Touch, which has a kind of a medium range to it. It's going to deal a very little bit of damage, but the coolest thing is that they've mentioned you can have elements on the Destruction Staff. And in this case, if you have a fire element, it's going to cause the Destructive Touch to do a small knockback. You're going to have Frost, causing a deep freeze, kind of, I would imagine, a very small duration hard CC of sorts, and then a shock version of the Destructive Staff. Jesus, cannot talk today. This is going to cause a disorient, kind of like a paralyze in other MMOs. That's pretty cool. The actual status effects for Fire, Frost, and Shock are very typical. That's kind of what you would expect. Maybe not Fire. I guess I would have expected Burn from that, but this is pretty cool. You got a nice variant depending on which element you're actually running on your staff. Now the next one is called Force Shock, which is going to deal a little bit of magic damage and then interrupt casting enemies. So again, we're seeing the ranged weapons actually have like one ability to interrupt from ranged, which is pretty damn cool. And then enemies you interrupt are then stunned as well. So there's pretty much a nice bit of CC going on here. Now the one thing I do want to wonder is Force Shock, because it's not like very descriptive on the element. I hope that the Force Shock and some of the other abilities we'll get into in a little bit actually add the element you have on the staff to the damage type. Maybe that would be pretty cool if that's even something they have implemented. But we'll move on to the next skill here, which is called Wall of Elements, which is going to create an elemental wall that deals a little bit of damage over a couple seconds for all the enemies inside the wall. Now, when they said wall, I got a little bit confused here, because when you say wall, to me, it means like there's an impassable object. Like this is more of a form of CC, and if the enemies pass through it, they're slowed, or they simply cannot pass through it. But instead, this looks to be more of like a line of damage that you'll just play down. So the easiest way to explain it would be probably you'll summon a wall of fire to just deal damage in a line. So the potential is cool there. I'm not really sure how I feel about just a wall of that without having any CC tied to it, because it just seems like if you have a wall of elements, you do something more. So I'm not really sure how I feel about that ability, but the idea is still pretty cool. I guess you can lay down a line of elemental damage on your enemies. Now the next ability is Impulse, which is going to deal a little bit of magic damage in a radius around you, and then it's also going to apply with a 100% chance, it says, to apply concussion, chill, burn, depending on which element you have attached. So I would imagine concussion is obviously going to be shock, the chilled is going to be frost, and then burning is going to be from your fire staff. That's pretty cool. This is another one of those things where it's like, depending on the element you chose, depends, it makes your skills act a little bit differently. I think that's really cool that they've done that with some of these skills in ESO. Now, the final active ability for the Destruction Staff is called Weakness to Elements, which is going to cause the enemy to have this debuff, which is going to cause 20% extra damage to come from your fire, shock, and cold. So to me, this says your left mouse button and your charged attacks with the mouse are going to cause extra damage depending on the element you have. And then it's also going to cause your Wall of Elements and Impulse to do extra damage as well. That's pretty cool. Weakness of Elements is probably one of those spells that's going to be really potent, and I would imagine is going to be one of those like must take if you use a Destruction Staff. But that said, all the skills and the actives on this guy are pretty interesting and pretty cool overall. Now that brings us to the passive abilities, the first of which is called Tri-Focus, which causes your Destruction Staff heavy attacks to have the following effects. If you have the Frost variation, it's going to cause a snare for a couple seconds. Your Shock variation is going to deal 10% splash damage to 2 nearby enemies. So the best way to think of that is maybe like a chain lightning effect. That's pretty cool actually. And then finally you have the Fire variation, reducing enemy spell resistance by about 80. Now, as I said at the beginning of this, the numbers don't really mean anything, and we have everything from 2 to 80 in this case, so we don't really know how powerful 80 will be, but that seems like a large number, so I'll say it's probably potent. The thing that I take away from this is that, again, you have a lot of utility based on your actual Destruction Staff typing, and it makes me wonder if with these different variations, could somebody use double Destruction Staff with different elements? I wonder if that's a possible build. That's a pretty cool idea, I think, if that's even something you can actually do. Now that brings us to the second passive, which is Penetrating Magic, which is your Destruction Staff spells are going to bypass some spell resistance. Again, there's a little bit more of this spell penetration going on. The next one is Elemental Force. While you have a Destruction Staff equipped, it's just going to increase your chance to apply your fire, shock, and cold status effects. Again, going back to the different elements you have available. Then you have Ancient Knowledge, which is going to cause your heavy attacks to charge about 10% faster. Now, from my understanding, when you use the heavy attacks with the Destruction Staff, it's going to charge up the element of choice you have and then fire a powerful spell after the, I guess, 1 second charge time or whatever it happens to be. So you'll be able to fire off powerful spells a little bit more quickly with this passive. And then finally you have Destruction Expert, which is going to cause about 40%, or not 40%, 40 base magicka increase when you kill an enemy with your Destruction Staff spells. This is just a little bit more magicka increase when you kill kill enemies. Jesus, cannot talk today. Apologies for my inability to properly get my ideas across. Goodness Lord. But yeah, let's go into overall what I think here. I'm not really a huge fan of staves, honestly. I'll be upfront about that. I'm not a huge fan of a character walking around with a staff in their hand. The aesthetic of it all just doesn't really appeal to me. And I guess in the case of WoW as well, you have the staff just sitting on your back while you're shooting skills out of your hand and stuff. I don't really understand why staves have, or staves rather, have this thing where you have it, but you can't like shoot spells out of it or anything. I'm not sure why that's never been implemented in an MMO, at least not any that I've played. But I guess it just can't appeal to everyone. I suppose I'm more in the camp where I would prefer a like a tome on the mage's or sorcerer's belt of sorts, and they can just cast spells through their words and hands. I'm more in that camp when it comes to the mage archetypes. But the skills overall, I would have to say, ignoring the aesthetic aspect of the staff, the skills are pretty cool. There's a lot of cool stuff going on with the different elements. One of the things that I'm really happy about is that they didn't do a very phone-in idea by duplicating a fireball style or pretty much just like a plain nuke of sorts. They didn't do that. They made sure to leave that kind of stuff to the light and heavy attacks for the staff itself. Instead, they've decided to give multiple elements to the weapons and provide a good amount of utility and choice with the actual weapon itself. So there's potentially even, you could look at it almost as if there's 3 different weapon choices within the Destruction Staff because of the different elements. So there's a lot of choice going on when you play this weapon, even after you've decided you want to play the ranged mage kind of archetype. That's a lot of cool stuff going on. In addition, there's a lot of control with the status effects, and there's the interrupt from range. Pretty much this is a well-rounded kind of weapon they have going on between all of the different status effects and the different element choices. Even if you have to just say I run only fire staff, the thing is there's still a good bit of CC coming from that. There's still good damage, there's still interrupts, so it's not like picking one over the other makes it weak or stronger than the other elements. At this point we don't know if, obviously there's going to be some balancing that needs to go on there, but overall each element seems to fit its role fairly well, and there doesn't seem to be a very obvious misbalance between them. Now finally we get to the Restoration Staff. Now the Restoration Staff is interesting because it doesn't actually do anything that the other weapons or classes do. It provides healing in a very direct manner, unlike a lot of the other skills from maybe the class skill lines and stuff like that. This is the only real weapon and real skill line available that is directly aimed at I play the healing archetype. But let's get into the active abilities. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end here. Now the first one is called Regeneration, which is just going to heal nearby allies in a nice radius around you, and then it's going to apply a slow ticking hot, which is heal over time for those who are unawares. So this is just going to heal the enemy, or heal your allies, and then it's going to apply a nice heal over time. That's pretty basic stuff. We have Grand Healing, which is going to heal all allies in a target area for a couple seconds. So this is going to leave a nice sized AoE on the ground, and any of your allies that step into it, including yourself I'd imagine, are going to be healed for the duration that they stand in the AoE. That's pretty cool stuff. That's typical MMO healing. We have Force Siphon, which is actually a 1.5 second cast time. This is going to cause your allies to attack the target of Force Siphon to heal 2% of the damage dealt. In addition, you're going to gain 50% additional health when you attack the target. So this is a pretty cool skill, actually. The thing is that I'm curious about here is, when I read this, is Force Siphon going to last long enough? Because it does say it has a 20-second duration, for example. does this go away if you switch weapons? So the idea that I instantly had was, if you want to play a tank character, for example, you can play for Siphon on a staff and then switch out to your one hand plus shield skill line, and you can swap the weapons, and then suddenly you have this ability to keep yourself alive, and then once it runs out, swap to the Force Siphon, grab it off, and switch again if you can do something like that. That's instantly the idea I had, so I think that there's maybe some potential for hybrid going on with this weapon. It's not so straightforward that healing people is the main goal. You can maybe do some mix and matching so that you can benefit another build. Now the next skill is Entropy. This is going to deal some magic damage over a couple seconds, or a dot as it were, and you're going to recover some magicka every couple seconds for the duration of Entropy. This is a pretty cool ability. You can just throw this out on the boss or tough enemies and recover some magicka, and then go back to your healing or whatever it was that you were doing. That's pretty cool, actually. I like that ability because it adds a little bit of damage from you, the healer, but it also allows you to regain some magicka to then further your heals. Now finally we get to the big one for the restoration staff. This final active is pretty cool. It's called Guardian Circle, which is going to place a large circle at a target location for about 12 seconds or so. It's going to increase allies' armor and spell resistance for a nice chunk as long as they're in the circle. This is going to deal magic damage to undead stuck in the circle, which is, as far as I know, this is only one of very few, if any, abilities that specifically call out a different enemy type. So undead are going to be injured more in this Guardian Circle ability. And then finally, allies in the circle may activate the synergy ability called Rejuvenate to restore health to themselves. This is like, when I seen this and read all of the abilities that go along with this guy, this is like ultimate level of complicatedness going on in this thing. This is easily the most potent skill in the skill line. It's easily got the most group content oriented abilities and effects tied to it. Overall, that's a really cool skill, and I'll get back to why I think that it deserves to be there after we go over the passives. But speaking of passives, the first one we have here is called Essence Drain. This is going to just allow the last hit of your heavy attack heals to do a nearby ally for about 30% of the damage done. So this is something I wasn't sure about, but it looks to be that your light attacks and your heavy attacks on the mouse are actually going to do kind of like a drain life style ability on the mob you hit. And then with this passive, you're going to actually heal enemies close to the target for a nice chunk of what the damage dealt was. So that's pretty cool. Now the next passive is Restoration Expert. This is just going to increase healing on targets under the 30% mark. This is very typical MMO stuff. You want to have that burst healing potential once they get below the like 30 or 25% life mark. Next up is Cycle of Life, which is going to gain 1% damage for every 10% health you have. Now this is a little bit interesting as well. This doesn't really fit with everything else. This allows you to potentially do a lot of damage with your Resto Staff for every 10% health that you have. So you keep yourself healed up a lot. If you keep yourself at the full health, you keep yourself at maximum health all the time, your damage potential is higher. That's a pretty cool ability, and I'm curious if there's a way to maybe take advantage of that in maybe a more damage-oriented build. Now, the next passive to go over here is called Absorb, and while you have the Resto Staff equipped, blocking spells is going to actually restore some magicka. I'm not sure how much this is going to get used, but it's still interesting. It allows you to apply some defense without being totally gimped because you've let yourself run out of magicka. This does give benefit to blocking, so it's not something you completely ignore as a healer with a Resto Staff. Now finally we get to Restoration Master, and this is just going to increase all of the healing that you do by about 5%. It's pretty potent, the percentage wise, but it's pretty bland in terms of a final level passive, but that seems to be the trend with ESO. Now the Restoration Staff easily is one of the more interesting weapons for a couple reasons that I've already mentioned. That it's the only weapon that provides sort of a direct healing role. It's the only one that has a potent ability on what I would call ultimate ability status. Guardian Circle is the only ability that even comes close to that outside of the actual class ultimates. That's a pretty potent skill that I think is going to just really make this healing style feel cool. I like the way that throughout the skills they've made sure to give somewhat of a balance between your mana regen, or magicka regen rather I should say. The AoE healing is there and the hot healing is there, but they've made sure to keep to what they promised about healers not relying so much on direct healing. Instead, the healing system is all about the AoEs and the hots, and in some small cases the smart heals. So it's going to be a lot more active, where you play in the fray of things, you're out there in the action, you're actually looking at the world and the action going on around you, and not so much on the UI and the health bars that are on screen. The real question I still have though about this, until I can personally play with it or see enough feedback from people who have, I'm not sure how well this healing setup in Elder Scrolls Online is actually going to sort of resonate with players that typically like to play the healing archetype in a more traditional MMO manner. I'm not really sure how this is going to go over with those guys, but only time will tell, honestly. The base premise is good. Keep the healers more active in the actual engagements going on, instead of staring at the health bars and playing whack-a-mole heal. This could go over well, it could go over badly. We'll just have to see, to be honest. But all in all, guys, I think that's everything for the weapons in Elder Scrolls Online, and that's going to do it for me today on this episode of Delving Deep ESO. Today we've gone over the bow, the destruction staff, and last but not least is the resto staff here at the end. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about these weapon skills, and how do you foresee yourself using them in your own character builds. Now, I want to say thank you so much for watching, guys, and if you enjoyed this in the slightest, I'd very, very much appreciate a thumbs up, a subscribe, a comment down below on anything Elder Scrolls Online, MMO, or gaming related in the slightest. Thanks again for watching, guys. This has been Pulse with another episode of Delving Deep ESO, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.